All right, so welcome back to Health Economics. So today what we're going to talk about is cost effectiveness. Now, one of the hallmarks of economics is our insistence that we should do things in a cost-effective way. Now, most people take from this a form of saying or asking the question, who's going to pay for that? And while in some settings that's a relevant question to ask, it's not at all what economists mean when we talk about being cost-effective. Instead, what we refer to is the notion of opportunity cost. Now, again, the opportunity cost of anything is the foregone choice. So for example, by watching this video, you're giving up time that could be spent doing something else. So one way to phrase this is the opportunity cost of anything is what you would be doing instead of what you're currently doing. Alternatively, we can think of the opportunity cost of anything as what you would have spent the money on if you didn't spend it on what you're spending on. But it's important to note that opportunity cost doesn't just refer to the actions that we take, but also to resources themselves. So for example, if I'm using this marker, then you can't. This marker's opportunity cost, therefore, is whatever who else could have used it would have used it for. We can think about the opportunity cost of things in the medical world pretty easily. So for example, detecting colon cancer is clearly an important thing, especially as you get older and your probability of getting it actually increases. For the most part, it can be detected with a simple test with pretty good accuracy. However, if you only get tested once, there's a chance that your test will come back with a false negative, or in other words, it will come back saying that you do not have colon cancer when in fact you do. One way to get around this is to do multiple tests. And if you do multiple tests, the odds of all of the tests coming back negative when you do in fact have colon cancer become much, much smaller. Now, if you get tested 6 times, then you will have a 99.9194% accuracy rating. In other words, the probability of you having colon cancer and all 6 of the tests coming back negative is 100 minus this number, so it's less than 0.1%. If you get tested 5 times, however, the probability is going to go down, but the probability goes down to 99.9190%. In other words, it only goes down by 0.0004%. Now, this is a very small number, and we might say, well, might as well get the 6th test anyway. But now if we consider that each test costs somewhere around $13,000, suddenly we have to ask the question, is this 0.0004% increase in accuracy worth another $13,000? Now, you can be tested 1,000 times and you still will not be guaranteed 100% accurate results. 6 tests at 99.9194% accuracy is pretty much as high as we can get. And so we consider this maximal performance. 5 tests is still very, very accurate. Not as accurate as 6, to be sure, but still very accurate. As an industry standard, we use 3 tests for colon cancer, which gives us about a 99% accuracy rating. Another 2 tests would therefore cost over $26,000. Most people aren't willing to pay that much money to get an extra 0.9% accuracy. And so we've come to define 3 as the optimal amount of testing to do per year once you hit a certain age. Some people will go ahead and get that 4th test, and some are satisfied after 2. Very, very few people get 5 tests, and even fewer get 6. So in this context, what the word optimal means is a comparison between the marginal cost of the test and the marginal benefit of the test. So here, The question we're implicitly asking is, how much more certainty will I get from another test, and how much more will that test cost me? In the case of the colon cancer test, for most people, an additional 0.0004% accuracy is not worth the $13,000. The other thing to consider is that that sixth exam, or that sixth test that you consume, is a test that someone else could have had instead of you. And so that test has an opportunity cost. It could have been used somewhere else. And it could have been used to perhaps be someone's first test, which does give some accurate results and is probably worth the $13,000 for that person. And so when we take into account the opportunity cost of these resources, we start to see things in a very different way. Now, as a quick side note, one reason why healthcare is so expensive in the US today is because we allow doctors to authorize and patients to consent to effectively spending the equivalent of a car to raise the detection probability of a disease by an infinitesimal amount, especially in patients who have very generous health insurance plans and coverage. In this context, the added benefit to that person is very, very small, but the added cost is very, very large. And so when economists point out inefficiencies in healthcare, this is the sort of thing that we're talking about. It's almost certainly more efficient for two people to get 3 tests each, giving them both 99% confidence in the results, than it is for one person to get 6 tests and have 99.9% confidence in their results. Now, this concept has a name, and it's called flat of the curve medicine. And the idea is fairly simple. If we were to plot sort of the benefits of healthcare against the cost, what we would find is a curve that looks something like this. Okay, so here, the first test for colon cancer increases your accuracy by quite a bit. With no tests, you have no accuracy. With 2 tests, you get to some higher amount of accuracy. With 3 tests, you get to an even higher amount. With 4 tests, you get to an even higher amount, and so on and so forth. But notice that by the time you get to, let's say, the 3rd test, and you move beyond that, the increase in your benefit from healthcare is vanishingly small. In the US, as it turns out, a lot of people are here and moving to the right. In other words, they're spending a lot of money, or another way to say this, they are having a lot of money spent through their insurance company to get more health care, but that additional health care only confers a very small benefit. Meanwhile, other people are stuck maybe down here, or perhaps up here, and moving to the left as the cost of healthcare continues to rise. This seems very inefficient. We have more and more people moving this way in the flat of the curve, and people being stuck here and moving left. So basically, some, if not most people in the US, are getting so much access to so much healthcare that the added benefit is almost certainly not worth the added cost of that additional healthcare to them. Meanwhile, many others are not getting the basic care that they need. This is the inefficiency that economists point out. As another side note, the reason why single-payer systems, such as those found in Canada, the UK, and Australia, cost less than healthcare in the US is actually related to this. In most single-payer systems around the world, they don't venture into this flat-of-the-curve region for anyone. For example, if you get macular degeneration in both eyes, most single-payer systems will only cover the cost of treating one eye, not both. Why is this? Well, because moving from 0 eyes that can see effectively to 1 eye that can see effectively is a huge improvement in your quality of life. Moving from 1 eye to 2 eyes is certainly important, but nowhere near as large an improvement as going from 0 to 1. However, it costs the same to treat each eye, whether it's your first eye or your second eye treated. And so you get a lot more, as we probably know, bang for your buck with the first eye being treated than you do for the second eye. Now, this doesn't mean that people in these systems can't get their second eye treated, but if they want to do so, they're going to have to pay for it out of pocket or with separate private insurance. So effectively, what insurance in the US does is mask the cost of additional health care to each of us such that we no longer ask the question, how much do I need this? And instead ask, is this covered? This means that we as people no longer weigh the cost of the procedure against the benefit of the procedure, but instead ask, how much is this going to cost me out of pocket, and how much will I benefit from this procedure? These are wildly different comparisons to be making and lead to lots of what economists refer to as inefficiencies. So in systems like those found in the US, what ends up happening is insurance plan administrators get to pick what kind of care the patients will receive by determining what is and is not covered. This can result in two different types of inefficiencies. The first one would be an inefficiency caused by overuse. And here, patients receive care whose value to society of providing it to them falls short of the cost to society of providing it to them, such as the 6th colon cancer test. The other type of inefficiency comes from underuse. And this is where patients do not receive care, the value of which The second type of inefficiency is called underuse. And this is where patients do not receive care whose value to society of providing it to them exceeds the cost to society of providing it to them. Okay, so this would be a case where someone does not get access to the care that they actually need that would provide a benefit to them over and above the cost of actually providing that care. Now, we can think about this in the context of a 2x2 matrix, which economists love to use. On this axis, we have the question of whether or not the care is cost effective, and we have a yes or a no. And on this axis, we have the care is provided, yes or no. Now, if the care is cost effective and it's provided, we would be in this cell here, where the answer to both questions is yes. And this is what economists would call optimal. In a situation where the care is cost effective, but it is not provided, this would be suboptimal, and we would know this as underuse. If the care is not cost effective and it's provided, this would be suboptimal, and this would be the overuse. And finally, in the case where the care is not cost effective and it is not provided, well, this is actually also optimal. We don't want care that is not cost effective. And again, by cost effective, we mean the opportunity cost of that care. We don't want care that is not cost effective to be provided. Now, a lot of economics is all about the study of incentives and how to better align those incentives such that the result is improved outcomes for everyone. So we could point this out to hospital administrators and policymakers, which several people have done, but it seems that there is very little being done or talked about being done that will actually address this. Alternatively, we could somehow inform patients themselves of their overuse of medical care by explaining to them the costs and benefits of, for example, additional testing and/or alternative treatment options. For example, do you really need that second eye treated for age-related macular degeneration? But then we're going to run into two problems. Most people probably don't understand the idea of diminishing returns and increasing marginal cost. The second problem would be if we don't change the incentives that people face, there likely won't be much of a big change in their behavior. So one thing we've seen a big increase somewhat recently are called health savings accounts, or HSAs. So rather than have people use insurance to pay for various things for medical care and treatment, they can instead use a health savings account. This works basically like a checking account, but can only be used to pay for medical expenses, and you must contribute to it out of your standard paycheck. However, there are some tax incentives that we've created in the United States on purpose to encourage people to put money in their HSA account instead of in their regular checking account. So why does this work? Well, because now going to the doctor costs you dollars instead of just costing your insurance dollars. You now become acutely aware of how much medical care costs and are more likely to ask the question, is this additional test or treatment actually worth the opportunity cost of the dollars? Now, if this all sounds kind of shocking or somehow inhumane to you, it turns out that we already do this in certain situations, and thank God that we do. Probably the most famous and oldest example of all of this is the triage of wounded people during mass casualty events. If the goal is to maximize the number of survivors, each patient is sorted upon entry into one of three groups. First will be those who will die with certainty. The second group will be those who will live or survive without treatment. And the third group would be those who will only live with treatment. Ghastly as it is to say this, we don't allocate hardly any care beyond pain management to the first group of patients. These are people who, unfortunately, due to the injuries sustained, are going to pass away regardless of whether we spend time treating them or not. We also don't really allocate a whole lot of resources to these people, the ones who will survive even without treatment, because again, they're going to survive even if we don't give them treatment. We tend to focus almost exclusively on this third group of patients. Why? Well, because they're the ones that giving the health care to actually makes a difference. In other words, while the marginal cost of providing care to any one of these three groups is basically the same, the marginal benefit of the care is greatest for the people in the third group. Now in practice, very, very few people actually get placed in this group, and we tend to err on the side of putting people in this third group anyway, because you never know. It could be the case that you're wrong. So this practice happens in the real world, unfortunately, but thank God that it does, so that we can use the scarce resources of medical care available at the scene of an accident most efficiently. Now this triage model has additional applications outside of the world of healthcare. For example, political strategists also apply the triage method to politics and deciding where to campaign by dividing states and counties into three categories. The first would be those that cannot be won even if the president campaigns there. So these would be safe seats for the opposition party. The second category would be those that will be won even if the president does not campaign there. So these would be considered safe seats for your own party. And the third category will be those that will be won only if the president campaigns there. These are otherwise known as vulnerable seats. The return to campaigning is the highest for the third group, and so political strategists will focus most of their efforts on those states and counties. We're now ready to talk about all of these examples in the context of a generalizable framework, the Equimarginal Principle. Basically, the Equimarginal Principle states that output is maximized if the marginal product is the same for all alternative uses of the resource. This sounds way more complicated than it actually is. So let's break it down into simpler terms. So let's start with a basic recognition. And we're going to say that the marginal benefit of anything is diminishing. In other words, as you get more of something, the total benefit will be increasing at a decreasing rate. In other words, it's going to look something like this. Now this is true of basically all of life. The first unit of whatever we're talking about is almost always more valuable to us than the second unit. Think about any time you've ever eaten food. The first bite of that food is always delicious. It tastes wonderful. By the time you're finishing up your meal, however, the food no longer tastes as good because you've already eaten plenty of it and you're starting to get full. In the colon cancer example, the first test gives us some degree of certainty about whether we have colon cancer or not. A second test gives us more certainty, but not as much more certainty as the first test. The third test gives us additional certainty, but not as much more certainty as the second test gave us, and so on. The marginal cost of each test, however, is either going to be constant or increasing, but let's just assume that it's constant just to make things clearer for us. Another, more recent example comes from the COVID vaccine. So right now, for most vaccines, we require 2 doses. But here's the thing. The first test, to the best of our knowledge, will boost your immunity up to about 80%. The second dose boosts you to 90% immunity. Now, 90 is certainly greater than 80, and there's no doubt about that. But would it be better to get twice as many people up to 80% immunity, or is it better to get a smaller number of people all the way to 90%? Now, I don't have the answer to this question, but I hope you can see that it's an important and interesting question. So what this means is that the first unit is worth a lot. The second one is worth not quite as much. So let's think about the triage example. Suppose we have 2 patients, A and B, who are in dire need of medical care, and, as luck would have it, we have 2 doctors. The care of 1 doctor is enough to save a patient's life. The care of 2 doctors will save the patient's life and also reduce the amount of physical therapy that the patient needs to return to full functionality. Without the doctor's care, the patient will unfortunately die. So let's think about the options that these people face. Now I've drawn a 3 by 3 matrix, so we're going beyond the 2 by 2 of normal economics here. I've drawn a 3 by 3 matrix detailing A and B and how many doctors they get. Okay? Now, if nobody gets a doctor, then A dies and B dies. If A doesn't get a doctor, but B does, then A dies and B lives. And if A gets no doctors and B gets 2, A dies and B lives and less physical therapy. Okay? If A gets 1 doctor and B gets 0, then A lives and B dies. If A and B both get 1, then A lives and B lives. And if A were to get 1, could B get 2? And as it turns out, the answer is no. Because again, there are only a total of 2 doctors, and if A were to get 1, that leaves only a maximum of 1 for B. And so this is not possible. And again, I want to stress this is not possible in the context where there are only 2 doctors. Now, if A gets 2 doctors and B gets 0, A lives and has less PT, but B dies. If A gets 2, B cannot get 1. So this is not possible. And again, 2 and 2 for both is similarly not possible, given the constraint that there are only 2 doctors available. Now, as a side note, a lot of people tend to point out how great it would be if both A and B could have 2 doctors, if we could be here. And this is all well and good. Nobody denies that everything would be better if both people in this scenario had access to 2 doctors. But in the context of this model and in the context of this hypothetical world, there aren't enough doctors for that. Saying that being able to give 2 doctors to everyone is a right does not change that fact. Now, the more interesting question here would be to ask, what if A has really great insurance and or is very rich, while B has bad insurance and or is not rich, and because of that, A ends up getting 2 doctors while B gets none? This is a much more interesting question to ponder about because there's actually something relevant to discuss. Now, I don't pretend to have the answer here. On the one hand, we can imagine a scenario where A would be willing to spend more money to hire the second doctor in order to save time with physical therapy. On the other hand, I find it hard to believe that this decrease in time is worth a human life.